All right, the next video that we're going to discuss is, next topic actually, is political corruption in what an era called the Gilded Age. Now, the Gilded Age and the Wild West were kind of in the same area, but the Gilded Age stuff was happening with American government and policies, whereas the Wild West stuff is kind of the lawlessness of the time. The most corrupt, or one of the most corrupt presidents in U.S. history was Ulysses S. Grant. Okay, this man right here. He was the Union lead general during the Civil War, so he commanded the entire Union Army. Basically, he was the most prominent general there. And after the war is over, he's a war hero, and now they elect him. Okay, one of the main groups of people that elected Ulysses S. Grant was black people. Okay, black men got the right to vote with the 15th Amendment, and because of that, they elect the guy who they viewed freed them, or one of the people. President Lincoln actually probably had a lot to do with that. But also Ulysses Grant, since he's the lead general of the Union Army, you know, he's seen as the leader there. So now Grant himself was a really good man, okay? But he had problems. One of his big problems is that he is a massive alcoholic, okay? This guy was probably drinking something like a fifth of whiskey a day, you know, or at least that's what the rumors are. So, you know, wake up, fix coffee, pour whiskey in it, and go about your day drinking all day long. That's his reputation. Some people have said that that's overstated, and it's just a political weapon against Grant. But there were several instances where he was drunk in public, or at least reportedly so. So, he was a good person, but he was naive. He appointed his friends to run the country for him while he was president. And his friends that he trusted took advantage of him severely. So even though he was honest as a man, his friends messed his whole presidency up. Okay? So, all right. So we're going to talk about four different scandals of the Grant administration, which makes him one of the most corrupt presidents in history. The first one is called Credit Mobilier. Okay, now Credit Mobilier is a railroad construction company, and they were hired by Congress to help build the Transcontinental Railroad. That is the railroad that went from one side of the country to the other. And if you remember from earlier in the chapter, that railroad connected up at a spot called Promontory Point, Utah. That's on your test. You need to know that's where it was in 1869. So Congress and the vice president both took kickbacks, okay? So here's how it would work, okay? The Credit Mobilier was hired to build this railroad. Now let's say, I'm just making up numbers here. Let's say the railroad's gonna cost $10 million, okay? So Congress budgeted $20 million to the Credit Mobilier company with the idea that they were gonna get $5 million back in bribes, okay? So a bunch of congressmen got bribes from this, and the vice president himself took kickbacks during this. Grant did not know what was going on, okay? Now, when the story broke, somebody had to take the fall, okay? Now look, this should show you how corrupt this was, okay? Grant didn't notice. Massachusetts Congressman Oaks Ames was found guilty of giving bribes, but nobody was ever found guilty of receiving bribes. So this is a freshman congressman, first term in office, okay? He goes away. He gets convicted of giving bribes out to people in Congress. But nobody that got the bribes got convicted of receiving the bribes. So one guy took the fall for the entire scandal. Oaks Ames goes to prison, and whenever he gets out of prison a couple of years later, he ends up having a massive bank account waiting for him. Okay, so he basically got paid to take the fall for all of these other congressmen and the vice president. All right. All right, the next one is the whiskey ring. Okay, so these are tax collectors that were bribed not to collect 90% of the whiskey taxes. This is called payola. Okay, payola is when you pay a law enforcement officer to look the other way while you do something illegal. Okay, so for instance, let's say we're at the Jack Daniel's distillery. Okay, and every barrel of whiskey is supposed to have a tax put on it. So the inspector comes by and he's counting the barrels, right? He's got, okay, so let's say it's a $10 tax per barrel. Well, if there's 1,000 barrels, then they owe $10,000 in taxes, right? Well, this guy would come by and he would say, all right, I see 100 barrels. So now they only have to pay $1,000 in taxes. Well, how did they get away with that? Well, payola, okay? The whiskey companies would actually pay the people that were supposed to count the barrels up to not report how many barrels were actually being made, okay? So this was so bad that 90% of the whiskey taxes in America were not collected. That's a huge portion, okay? All right, the next one is something you've already talked about, the Indian Raid, okay? Secretary of War took bribes to allow the Indians to receive rotten meat. So you remember the story about the Indians, the Cheyenne, that got the rotten buffalo meat? That was actually allowed by the U.S. government through a bribe illegally, okay? And this was actually Grant's Secretary of War who did this. Now, the one that is the most egregious, the one that angers me the most, is the Secretary of the Navy took bribes and inflated costs and used cheap materials when building ships for our Navy. Instead of having steel that's this thick, they would build them out of steel that's this thick. And therefore, our ships were not strong enough. And there's one instance I know of that a ship literally cracked in half, okay, under normal circumstances. They weren't even in a battle or anything. And a lot of the sailors that were on that ship died, so this guy, Secretary of the Navy at the time, could actually line his pockets with American tax dollars. Now, all this stuff really brought the Grant administration down. Eventually, after a second term, Grant retires, kind of as a defeated president, and he finds out that his years of smoking a box of cigars a day, which is 20 big old fat long cigars, has given him throat cancer. And at this point, President Grant is dead broke. Okay, he has no money, so he's gonna die an ex-president that is shamed and with no money. He actually owes money, and his family's gonna have to pay this money off. So Grant comes up with a scheme right before he dies. He says, I'm gonna write my autobiography, okay? So his presidential memoirs, in other words. So Grant goes to a cabin, and for 3 weeks, he just writes and writes and writes. And in 3 weeks, the entire huge book is finished, okay? And I think a few days after he finished his book, he died from throat cancer. Now, it really was a success because President Grant got to pay off all of his debts with the money, his family did, and his family actually got to keep some money after that. But it started a long tradition, a precedent, if you will, that after presidents get out of office, they usually write their memoirs, and their memoirs sell for a bunch of money, and this is one way that ex-presidents make money off of the office, okay? So for the rest of the video, we just have a few pictures I'm going to talk about, okay? All right, so this is the Wild Bunch, okay? There's a group of cowboys, bank robbers, basically. Anyway, Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, okay? This right here, y'all remember Buffalo Bill's Wild West show? Well, this is Miss Annie Oakley, okay? Annie Oakley was a really good trick shot shooter. So her famous shot was she would get a rifle and put it backwards on her shoulder. And then using a lady's compact mirror, she could split a card, okay, at 50 feet, a playing card in half at 50 feet by shooting the rifle facing backwards and with a mirror. So I don't know about y'all, but I can't shoot nearly that way. So these are a few other colorized photographs of some Native Americans from the 1800s, okay? This is Miss Annie Oakley when she got older. This is actually Deadwood, South Dakota, around 1901, okay? That's one of the bars there. You could see the spittoon where everybody in the whole bar would spit in there, okay? Spit their tobacco. And that's it for the chapter, y'all. This chapter is done. Make sure you study for your test. You have all the notes, you have all the videos. If you missed something, you need to go back and watch it. And I'll see you for the next chapter.